Welcome everyone to our third panel of our Price of Good Health series. We're going to wait a minute to let people enter into the Zoom meeting. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Joel White. I'm the president of the Council for Affordable Health Coverage. Welcome to part 3 of our Price of Good Health Summit series. As a quick refresher, CAHC is a broad-based advocacy alliance with a singular focus that's bringing down health costs so that all Americans have affordable health coverage. We are here today to talk a little bit about competition, an often overlooked aspect of healthcare, but an important one. And we're really excited to have our panel here today. I think one thing I'd just say is that, price of healthcare is headed in the wrong direction. Costs are typically increasing 3 to 4 times faster than wages, which means that affordability is going down. So each year we convene this summit where we aim to kind of unearth the challenges and develop the solutions that we will advocate for before Congress to help reverse that healthcare cost crisis. And so I wanted to thank our sponsors to start off here, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, the Better Medicare Alliance, and Pharma. Our theme this year is the pandemic, basically what happened during the pandemic, what lessons we could draw from it, and where we need to go next. And that includes how it impacted the healthcare cost curve, how it's impacted access and coverage, and brings us to today's panel, which is how has it impacted competition? Where do we need to go from here? We're going to start off today's session with a panel discussion around COVID and its impact on competition. And we're featuring leaders from the American Enterprise Institute, Avalon, Pharma, and Sidecar Health. And I'm really excited because these guys are fresh. They've gotten their morning cup of coffee and we're ready to go and talk about competition. So I wanted to just say a few things about competition, then we'll get right into the panel. Because afterwards, at 1 o'clock, we're going to have a sit down with the 30 for 30 caucus co-chairs. 30 for 30 is a congressional caucus. It's chaired by Congressman Jody Arrington, a Republican from Texas, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, and Scott Peters, a congressman from California, a moderate Democrat, and on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And so it's exciting. I'm really glad those members of Congress and this panel can join us today because competition is an important issue. Right now, competition in the healthcare market in the U.S. is largely lacking. And we'll hear from our panelists on this, but you could drive from Washington, D.C., where I am right now, all the way out to Seattle and down to San Diego and all the way across to Miami and never drive through a competitive hospital market. In fact, 90% of our hospital markets or north of that are uncompetitive as measured by the Federal Trade Commission. And what we see both before and during the pandemic is more merger and acquisition activity. And every time, a big system merges in a market, we see increase in prices of about 40% on average. And increased prices, keeping utilization the same, ends up in higher costs paid for and higher premiums and higher out-of-pocket costs. And then, the third point and last point I'd make is that a lot of this is policy driven. Competition policy is set by rules of the road and has enforcers, but sometimes those rules don't make sense and those enforcers lack muscle in making sure that we have competitive markets. And so one byproduct of that is that we see less access in communities. We have fewer community-based providers because over the past decade or more, they've been selling to big health systems and becoming, less accessible to the community and higher cost because of reimbursement differences, particularly in Medicare, which pay higher reimbursement in a hospital setting than they do in a community setting. And so some of this is policy driven, some of it is a lack of enforcement, some of it is market dynamics. And but it's all important because lack of competition leads to less access and higher costs, which ultimately is borne by the consumer. And I do want to mention, I said that was my last point, but obviously big focus of Congress and the administration over the past several years has been prescription drugs and what's happening in prescription drug markets. And I think that, you know, from my perspective, we think about COVID and this exciting period of innovation that we just came through, where we had a vaccine developed and out the door basically within 9 months. And now we have hundreds of different products in the pipeline, which is exciting. But we also have policies on the table that I think would inhibit innovation and price competition by bringing fewer products to market. So we'll get into some of those exciting prescription drug issues as well, and talk a little bit about what Congress is doing or planning to do, and how that might impact competition broadly. So I'm excited. This is something that I'm very passionate about. I love competition because we see it every day in televisions and cell phones and airline services, but we don't see it in healthcare, and I'd love it if we did see it in healthcare. So let's get started. Panelists, if you want to unmute yourselves and make sure your camera is turned on. And so I just wanted to jump right in and maybe get each person to kind of introduce themselves and then say a little bit about your perspective on how the pandemic has impacted competition in healthcare. And I'll just kind of go Hollywood Square style, who I see next. And Ben with the American Enterprise Institute, I'm going to call on you first.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. So my name is Benedict Ippolito. I'm an economist at the American Enterprise Institute. And as it pertains to this competition question, I think, you know, with COVID, it's sort of interesting. The researcher in me is always very nervous about N=1 settings and drawing too much from sort of one-off situations. But to my eye, anyway, at least in the provider market, it seemed to me that there were a lot of things that perhaps COVID exacerbated that maybe already existed to some extent. Even if we think about parts of the market where COVID represented a relatively transitory shock, right? The acute care hospital market, for example, really severe reductions in revenues in spring 2020, I guess, and summer 2020, but with fairly non-trivial rebounds over time. Well, if you're a really, big hospital with a good payer mix and good financial strength, you're really set up for this situation. Well, you can probably weather that storm. If you're a rural hospital with a less advantageous payer mix, with declining admission rates already, well, you already were kind of financially tenuous, and maybe COVID pushed you over the edge a little bit. And so I think when we think about those kind of incentives, it seems to me that COVID probably hit the places the hardest that were already struggling the most, and the places that were already perhaps the most susceptible to some of these consolidation type moves or even closures. And certainly when you look at the physician market, you saw a longer term downturn that, again, if you are already on the edge of thinking of, well, maybe I want to group together with some other practices, or maybe I want to join a hospital system, COVID probably, if anything, pushed you a little bit in that direction. So to my eye, it seems that it sort of exacerbated things. And I guess the final point to key in on one thing that you brought up, Joel, is that, of course, our policy decisions matter for these things, right? And when we think about what we did from a policy perspective, certainly in the provider space, it was pretty, quick and dirty, maybe you would say, and maybe not perfectly targeted, certainly second best. And when you look at the way we distributed funds in relief efforts, for example, it was really unclear that we were hitting the places that perhaps were most at risk of consolidating or most at risk of closures. And so I worry a little bit that COVID has sort of hit the fast forward button on some of these problematic trends that we were already seeing. Well, since Joel's muted, maybe Pat, you want to take the next step?
I'll jump in. Thanks, Ben. So first of all, Joel, really appreciate you having me on. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sidecar Health, and in the context of competition, Sidecar Health is a consumer-driven health plan. And so, as I think about how we're seeing in terms of how the pandemic has impacted competition, let's look at it a little bit from the consumer perspective. So from the consumer perspective, it's actually been pretty exciting. And that is with regards to care delivery, right? So you see the advent of a lot more virtual care. And obviously you have virtual telehealth, but it's more than that. So we're seeing virtual mental health with a very large uptake that I know we can all kind of agree with, but it's also things like physical therapy. And so where we get excited is that tech-enabled health and digital health and access to health has been broadened under the pandemic. And it's not just for, the young and hip. It's basically all spectrums of the age group, all consumer segments are starting to access care in the way they need to access care, which we think is a really important trend in terms of how do we facilitate increasing competition, because our view is that if we can increase competition, increase transparency, increase choice, you can sustainably reduce cost in the US healthcare system over time. And so while there definitely has been parts of the consolidation, and there's definitely been things under the pandemic that could put downward pressure on competition, it is exciting to see from a consumer perspective, there actually has been increased opportunity through a movement of virtual care from niche to mainstream.
Thank you, Patrick. And we're going to come back and get back to some of the things you just highlighted, because the remote care, the transparency, the benefit innovation, I think are all important. Jason, we saw during COVID, intense focus on lab results and lab services, and we saw some chaos. What did you see? And, talk a little bit about competition from your perspective.
Great. Well, thank you, Joel, for having me here today. Jason Bush with Avalon Healthcare, the Chief Data Officer, and we are solely focused on laboratories and laboratory benefit management. So our perspective at Avalon is really how the laboratory providers, whether they be hospitals, physician offices, or independent laboratories, play in the market. And so that little background on us there. COVID absolutely put the lab business in the front and foremost spotlight of the American public's mind. I've never seen, and I'm a laboratory guy, I've been in the lab for about 9 years before I came to Avalon, and I'd never seen public articles in the New York Times or anywhere talk about false positive rates or false negative rates, or what the consequences are of getting a test result wrong, or why there's no over-the-counter testing. All those issues became public mind with COVID, and the response, which Benedict alluded to, by the policy setting was very haphazard, very knee-jerk, very quick, and could have been better. And we learned a lot of lessons from that as an industry, which we can get back to at some point today if the topic comes up on more details with that. But with respect to competition, if our business, or our view of the business, really is determined by some of the hospital activities. So as Benedict alluded to, as there's more mergers, there's more leverage for those mergers to actually drive prices up. And some of that is just through site of care selection. If you've got a physician office practice that gets gobbled up by a hospital, their charge rates and fee schedules are going to be much higher than you would get in other areas of the country or other areas. So, and laboratory on the competition side is probably one area where there is potentially, in many cases, a national competitive nature. You've got two large behemoths, you've got a couple other very large independent laboratories that do full service that compete with the hospitals. And so it really becomes a mind share competition and ease of access competition. And there's very different ways that the different players work through those market strategies.
Great. I know we're going to get back to labs, because COVID testing remains problematic, and would love to get into Binax and some of the things we're seeing off the shelf and what that's doing to competition, as we try and reopen and go forward. Jenny, obviously huge focus right now of Congress, the administration, and has been really for the past couple of years on prescription drugs. And I talked a little bit about what we came through during the pandemic with the vaccines, but also pipeline, and we're starting to see some of those treatments come out. Talk a little bit about competition from your perspective.
Well, happy to talk about competition and the role of government. I just wanted, in some ways, if possible, to loop back on the COVID and some of the lessons too from COVID for our industry. I mean, I think I would highlight maybe 3 lessons. One is that I think we learned that the reason we were able as an industry to turn around quickly and produce vaccines and treatments so rapidly here in sort of a miraculously short amount of time was because we've had decades of investment in research and basic science that laid the groundwork. And so I think one clear lesson is that we do need to continue that investment in regular times so we're well prepared for pandemics. And I think people sort of take for granted all of that, those decades of previous investment, and assume that we can just, turn out miracles without that sort of cumulative infrastructure, which I think we can't. A second lesson I think is also instructive, which is we really learned that we need multiple shots on goal to be successful. And I think countries that like China or Russia that thought they could just do it with one are, not as happy with the results as we are, having, really let 1,000 flowers bloom, and a lot of efforts generated, multiple vaccines. And so at the end of the day, having multiple shots on goal is really important. And that's another lesson that I think applies more broadly. We hear a lot that we just need, that we just need the breakthroughs. We don't want the Me Too's. And like the fallacy there is that how were we going to pick in 2019, in 2020, early 2020? Like, how are we going to pick at the beginning of the pandemic which of the manufacturers was going to produce the right vaccine? I don't think we knew. And that's the joke here, right? Like, you don't know until after a drug has been approved, or even sometimes multiple years afterwards, like what their true contributions are to advancing the standard of care. And we need multiple shots on goal, and that's sort of the way the ecosystem works. And then I guess the third lesson, sadly, is that even if you avert, millions of lost lives and millions of hospitalizations, Americans still are electing folks who are prepared to throw out a lot of innovation if we can get a short-term win on reducing costs for patients now, throwing out like potential innovation for the future. So that's a sad story. Sort of the association lobbies me has to say, like, that's the other lesson here, is that even if you literally save the world, people are really mad about prices and willing to sort of churn out bad policy quickly without a hearing to even talk about it.
Let's stay with that for a minute, Jenny, because it kind of, the politics and the multiple shots on goal issue kind of comes into play here. I think most people know CBO said, maybe up to 59 products wouldn't get developed. There's other estimates as high as 320, 330 products over the next 30 years wouldn't get developed as a result of the legislation that would allow the government to set a price for the drug under the guise of negotiations. Can you talk a little bit about why the bill leads to that outcome? And one thing that people haven't talked about that strikes me is that if we've got fewer products on the market, we have less competition, right? And less competition means less price competition. So at some second order effect of this bill is we're actually going to have some higher costs in drugs that may not be, price controlled.
Yeah, I think sadly, I think that's really dead on. It's very hard to figure out exactly what the impact on innovation will be. The relationship between price setting and reduced innovation is clear, right? We know the directionally what happens, and we don't necessarily know exactly what the magnitude is, but it could be really large, and it could also be disproportionately aimed at the kinds of innovations we need or want. I mean, I think one of the things I'm worried about is that the bill is kind of framed as a moderate, incremental approach, but there are many, many details here which are not moderate at all. And I would say that the impact, for example, on the market for generics and biosimilars is really going to be quite severe. And the reality is that in our marketplace today, it is the generics and the biosimilars that are sort of the built-in cost containment, that are the engine of that built-in cost containment for the whole system. So we are sort of swapping, price setting for 20 drugs per year in place of, really healthy incentives for people to bring forth generics and biosimilars that could affect, many, many hundreds of drugs, right? And lead to deeper, deep price cuts over long periods of time. So we have to worry about innovation and what it's going to do for, the cancer business model, which today is, frequently you launch a drug with one indication and a tumor, one tumor site, and then you sort of over time build others, and like you continue to invest after that drug's on the market, which I think won't be viable if you go to cost plus pricing in year 13. So we have to worry about like new medicines, we have to worry about post-approval research, and then we have to worry about the biosimilars that won't come to market. And yeah, there's a lot here to be worried about, and that's before you get to even the impacts for the Part D competitive model and whether that's really sustainable over time. So, I mean, I do think we worry that this is sort of signals a shift in support for letting, for sort of fixing the market to support for government intervention as a preferred alternative. And there's not very much in the bill that actually addresses some of the things that I think there's widespread recognition need to be fixed, sort of pervasive issues related to conflict of interest and incentives that drive use of higher cost medicines as opposed to lower cost medicines, related to, for example, the rebates, which, just not being addressed here at all. So we would have said a preferred approach is fix the market, but it feels like where we're sort of headed is throw it out. But it is definitely being described as a incremental approach, and I would urge everyone to read the bill more closely, because there's nothing incremental about going to basically cost plus pricing in year 13.
Well, as someone on the Ways and Means Committee staff who helped write that Part D law, I can tell you that the competition was our primary goal, and I think we succeeded with 900 or so plans available across the country, and a competitive market that kept premiums basically the same for 10 years, which is unheard of in healthcare. Any healthcare plan with stable premiums over a 10-year period, basically $32 to $35 per month, is just unheard of, and came in under budget by hundreds of billions of dollars compared to the CBO estimate. And people like it. But that's me opining on a product that I worked on 17 years ago. So, but let's stick on drugs for a second. I'll go to Ben. So Ben, you've taken a look at the bill, and you've kind of looked at some of these negative impacts, but you've also looked at things like 340B and the dynamics that creates in hospital purchasing and physician competition. Can you talk about some of those dynamics and how those are playing out? Because there's nothing in this bill, Build Back Better, that addresses the 340B issue.
No, I mean, yeah. So I'll stick to the 340B specific part. We can talk about other pieces of the Build Back Better drug stuff if you want. But yeah, I mean, 340B is a good example of a broader concept, which is that, we're often trying to design public policy to achieve a stated goal, but it often has, consequences that are not super easy to predict. This one actually wasn't that hard to predict, I don't think, but sometimes they're a little harder to predict. But of course, the 340B program, it actually shares in some sense some similarities, I think, to the way that Part B inflation rebates work in this bill. But it allows hospitals basically to get a big discount on purchasing drugs. And in theory, they're supposed to be passing those along in some sort of ill-defined way towards, providing some type of care for, lower income, marginalized groups, whatever it is. That's not the right language, but lower income groups, basically. And but there's nothing that requires them to actually do that. So basically what you've done is you've created a law that says, well, we're going to allow you to have some advantageous purchasing arrangement for some supply X, and you can do whatever you want with that money. Well, of course, what does that do? That creates a tremendous arbitrage opportunity where suddenly the hospital, now, if you're an oncology practice, it's way better to be at the hospital because you can buy your supplies for so much less and you basically just split the rent with the hospital. And suddenly you, the oncologist, are so much better off just being in the hospital. So suddenly what do you see? Well, places like oncology groups that dispense or administer a lot of medications suddenly get bought up more and more by hospitals, right? So it's a perfect example of how we think about this competition issue. And I think there is 100% something to be said for the fact that healthcare is not like every other market. There are some pieces of healthcare that don't function quite like other markets. There are emergencies, right? There are some places in America that can't support lots of hospitals. That's all true, and that's kind of a natural issues. But there's a lot of self-inflicted issues too. So when you write a bill that basically creates this crazy situation where it's almost implausible. It's amazing to me that like some oncology groups are not affiliated with hospitals in some sense, with 340B hospitals. And so when you think about what are we going to do about competition, to me, I look at the landscape and say, okay, the really hard stuff is the stuff that's really intrinsic natural features of healthcare that are difficult to actually, grapple with. These things where we create the problem aren't so difficult to grapple with. Change the thing that creates the problem, right? And I think that's a theme that we see a lot, not just in hospitals, not just in drugs, but sort of throughout healthcare. Say, let's identify these things that are providing the underlying incentives that deliver the lack of competition, which then delivers high prices that we don't think reflects value. Let's get at those actual underlying things in the first place, rather than trying to come around on the back end after encouraging everybody to consolidate and say, geez, I don't love that price you're charging, right? So I think that's sort of the theme that the 340B issue speaks to for me. And I know it's certainly not unique, but it is a good example of how those kinds of policies can have those kinds of effects.
So in that regard, I mean, we're looking at the Build Back Better legislation, and Jenny just talked about the drug side of things. You talked about the hospital dynamics. Are you surprised that the bill doesn't really go at some of these cost centers? Like the majority or the plurality of the healthcare dollar spend is in hospital world and then physician world, and prescription drugs are about 10%, and so it's not really focused on where most of the dollars are. Is that kind of odd to you?
And it's odd to me, but I don't understand politics, so I guess to some extent maybe it's not that surprising. But I mean, yeah, if I were to rank order the issues that I see in healthcare, I don't know that this bill really sort of goes after my first priorities. It's particularly when you see things like even the way the bill works. Again, there are flavors of these kinds of policies in there. So there's an inflation rebate in Part B drugs, so physician administered drugs. You can't inflate your ASP, your actual net price of your drug, too fast. Well, implicitly, what does that do? That just affects the price that the hospital pays for the drug. But there's nothing in there that says the hospital has to do anything with whatever it saves based on that provision. So what's the hospital going to do? This is it's like a weaker 340B for basically every hospital. So suddenly the hospitals now have another little advantage when they buy the drug over, say, a non-hospital based. I think they would be having an advantage over a non-hospital base. I need to double check that. But in any event, it's like a random transfer within the healthcare sector that doesn't necessarily go to any consumers. It just goes to a hospital margin, I guess. And so when I look at that again, I'm saying geez, this doesn't seem like it's the top priority if I were to rank order. And that doesn't mean there are not issues in the drug market by any stretch of the imagination. But if I were to rank order things, I don't think this bill certainly hits my top 2 or 3.
Got it. Jason, I just had my brain tickled last week because I had a contact tracing event, came into contact with someone who might have had COVID, and that was a fun experience. But what we've seen during COVID was kind of a policy response that was kind of strange, right? Like we wanted everyone to have access to free tests, and we kind of shifted that burden onto insurers. Right. But the insurance benefit market is a bit disorganized. So what did we learn about how some of those policy changes altered some of those market forces? Where do you see that headed, going forward?
Well, let's talk a little bit about where it went. or what happened. So when the CARES Act, and there was another one that Family First Act, I believe they were the two ones. They really stipulated that insurers had to cover anybody, all testing and all workups to COVID and all treatment with COVID, all had to be covered 100%, no member cost share. And then subsequent to that, they came out and they started pricing what those laboratory tests were actually going to be worth in the market. And it was significantly higher than many other equivalent type tests. And you immediately, starting in April of 2020, you started seeing massive influx of health insurance claims for COVID cases. And that was in addition to all of the state funded and federal funded testing sites that popped up all over the country. So the access to testing was ubiquitous. You could go anywhere to get testing. You may have to wait a while, but you could go anywhere. And testing was limited and rationed for a while because the supply chain could not keep up with demand. The first commercially available test was actually developed in University of Washington in February, and they had a very difficult regulatory pathway of how they could actually get it to market, which was surprising at the time. But the FDA had unclear regulations and fits and starts with getting their product, their regulatory framework out there for the emergency. So we saw a lot of testing occur in 2020. It's then started flowing up and down as the surges happened throughout the United States. And the supply chain finally caught up so that everybody could do it. And there were laboratories coming out of the woodwork to do testing because it was so lucrative financially for these laboratories to do it. And there was no member chase. So you could go out, you could set up a system for a couple $100,000, you could do your testing, you get lots of money, and you didn't have to worry about getting a patient responsibility. And patients were there, they needed the testing, they had an exposure, they had a contact trace, they had a sniffle, they immediately went in and got tested. So there was a massive amount of testing, and it was fairly well subsidized by the federal government and state government at the time. And it slowly started working its way over to the insurance companies, and the insurance companies are bearing the brunt of it. It's much harder to find a public site for COVID testing at this point, but they still exist. But most is going to go through insurance at this point, and the insurers are having a difficult time because the public health emergency is still in effect. They're still obligated to cover it. They're still obligated to pay 100% for it. And so one of the factors or one of the responses to this is a lot of employers and universities are starting to run their testing, their contact tracing, routine testing through their insurance benefit, which is causing some friction with both parties on that front, as whether it should be a covered benefit or it should be subsidized. And then throw on top of that all the innovation that came out very early on and is now very much out there of over-the-counter testing or at-home testing, which made it even more available, but then actually took some of that insurance cost and transferred it to private cost, where I, as an individual, can go out and buy a Vinoc test now and I can actually find out if I have COVID anytime I want, assuming I can find one. Again, supply chain issues, but those are getting caught up. So it's interesting to see the change from federal government subsidized to the health insurance are actually paying for it to now it's actually moving to the private market with the innovation coming out. And I believe this opens a opportunity for a lot more in testing to become over the counter. The technology, much like Jenny mentioned, the pharmaceutical had all the investment to build this vaccine in 9 months. There is now a pathway, a regulatory pathway to get other testing from concept in a laboratory into consumers' hands that they can utilize themselves, which will be great for competition and also great for healthcare in terms of where the cost is actually being borne.
And that's highly dependent on policy, though, right? Like I had a friend who came over recently and visited us from Britain and had to provide his proof of vaccine just to get a visa.
Yep.
And he said that, in Britain, the model is 7-day testing on demand delivered to your doorstep, with rapid, Binacs or other tests. We don't have that in this country. And in fact, in the OSHA rule, we could say that's not good enough, right? You have to get a different kind of test.
Correct.
So is policy inhibiting that dynamic that you just talked about?
Absolutely. There can absolutely be policy inhibitions to this activity. some of the rapid at-home tests for what is considered the gold standard still go through regulatory pathways, still have to show a burden of evidence to actually get that out into the market. So instead, you have a lesser test which can be used effectively to, it's not I wouldn't say a 100% diagnostic test, but it will, in properly used, help inform and determine whether you should have a follow-up test of the gold standard, or if you feel you've got enough symptoms that corroborates it and you should just assume that your positive was correct. So policy can have a big impact. I have family members in South America, and they, for a period of time, they had to do testing to come in, go out of the United States, go into their own country. They had to go in and out. So policy has a very large impact on the innovation of these tests and how quickly they'll be adopted, or what can constitute acceptable levels of testing for an individual to, I'll say, reacquaint themselves with society, but that's probably a little strong.
And you would suggest, we need more investment, we need more, allowing those at-home tests or those off-the-shelf tests to be acceptable in terms of, a return to work strategy, or in terms of meeting the vaccine mandate.
They are absolutely a one means to do it. So either testing or vaccine status has to be a way to accomplish that in a work that is a very company specific activity at this point in time. We were surprised in some respects that testing was not an allowable, I believe it's not an allowable means in some of these laws that are being put forward, or regulations that are being put forward. Some areas of the country it's not, you have to be vaccinated. So it is very disparate. It's very hodgepodge across the entire United States as to what the policy is and how you have to comply with it.
All right, Jason, you brought up the insurers and what they're dealing with on the testing side. Patrick, I want to come to you because I think, as a lot of people think about Affordable Care Act, insurance coverage, we want more people covered. A lot of people have universal coverage as a goal, which is one of the CHC goals. But people think about the ACA almost like a formula, right? Like they say, well, you've got to cover these benefits, and you've got this premium subsidy, and you've got these parameters that you've got to meet. And we see, companies getting into markets based on subsidy rates and risk profiles and things like that. You have a bit of a different approach. Can you walk us through, what you're thinking about in terms of, universal coverage and getting more benefit innovation in the ACA market, and how that's going to affect competition?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a very different perspective of how do we solve the overall kind of problems with the U.S. healthcare market. We clearly think that competition is the way to go. And building on what Jason said, I think the testing situation is a microcosm for the overall bigger problems around confusion about what's covered, what are the costs, where do I get access to care, is it through the government? And then with this steady secret march to pushing more cost on consumers. So, so we have a totally different approach to health insurance that we think is ultimately going to be able to solve some of the fundamental issues. And so Sidecar Health is a modern kind of common sense approach to health insurance. So we view increasing access to coverage and increasing affordability. We accomplish those objectives through two things. So one is transparency and choice. So we give 100% complete transparency into what cost of any medical care is, as well as what the benefits are for that medical care. And then we combine that transparency and knowledge with purchase power. We give the ability for our members to engage directly in the healthcare system and pay for care instantly when they need it, unconstrained by networks. And so as we think about the objective that we should all have, of how do we go ahead and make sure everyone's covered adequately to get access to good care, right? We think the solution to that approach is to actually embrace economics and turn patients into purchasers of care, right? And because in doing so, we can move away from a world where we are reducing access by narrowing networks, and we are reducing benefits by narrowing coverage, introducing things like constrictive formularies or pre-authorizations, all these things designed to control costs through limiting benefits, as opposed to controlling costs by, eliminating the administrative costs in the system that are unnecessary. And so we see a world where if you can empower consumers with money and information, and you can have them engage with the hospital systems directly, with providers directly, you can actually lower the cost of care overall. And going back directly to your question on the ACA, we just launched our first ACA plan in the state of Ohio, and we're really excited about it because by the way that our model works is we've been able to introduce a health plan that actually is the broadest benefit plan available because we aren't constrained by formularies and pre-auth. So it's taking kind of the essential health benefits to a higher level because you don't have the traditional insurance constraints. And then we're combining that with the broader access, right? We enable people to buy care directly with doctors by giving people a Visa card that connects directly to our claims account. So our members walk around with literally an insurance company in their wallet. So like, we like to joke, as you know, Joel, like everybody takes Visa, like people like to get paid. So you can engage directly with your urgent care, you can directly with your primary care provider, you can directly with hospital systems on knee replacements. It's the continuation of a model building on what Jenny and Ben have kind of called out. Like we should all be very careful if we are getting in the way of the invisible hand. Like the invisible hand and market forces have demonstrated the ability to lower costs in every market. And yes, there are absolutely situations where you can't ask pricing and emergencies, and there needs to be protections for those things. But we have proven again and again in every market that we can solve a lot of the issues that we're talking about here by simply providing people choice, transparency, and let providers compete for members and let members actually know pricing to engage in the system. And so we think this is a model that's great for the ACA. It's great for healthcare in general. It's great for providers because providers can get rewarded for delivering, differentiated services, higher quality services. And it's great for members because they can access care in the way that they want at the price that they want. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's stick with this for a minute. So if I understand correctly, so my understanding of the model is that, say I'm in Ohio and I want to go see my primary care doctor, and the average price for an E&M visit is $100. Sidecar will give me a view of there's 3 doctors in your area. One's 120, one's 100, and one's 80. If I choose the 80, I get a check in the mail for $20. If I choose the 120, I pay the 20, but I can see the quality of each provider's services and I can go to any of them, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, you picked a very simple example. I actually think in the state of Ohio, the average cost for a doctor visit is more like $180, but your answer is exactly correct. So what we do is we've designed a plan where members know their benefits for anything you can do in the US healthcare system. And one of the things that the administration has done a great job with is facilitating transparency. I think we can all agree that like the push towards transparency on shoppable services is great. So I think we're at the point where 500 services are actually public and transparent, and that's wonderful. Well, there's 170,000 things you can do in the US healthcare system. So we've got a journey to go to bring transparency to its appropriate conclusion. And that's what we've done. So we've used a doctor visit. We've provided 100% transparency on what the average cash price is in any zip code for any service you can do in the US healthcare system. And then we have combined it with a benefit amount, which matches the average price. So using your example of a doctor visit, let's say a doctor visit costs $100. Our benefit would be $100. And then our members can choose to go to any doctor they want. And if they choose to go to a doctor that charges $120, they immediately understand that their portion is going to be $20. It's the amount that would be above the benefit amount. But likewise, if they go to a doctor that charges $80, we still pay $100 and the member keeps the extra $20. And so what's not well understood, although for the pharma experts on the call, you guys understand that like the pricing in pharma is wildly variable. Right? So the same price, generic or branded, like they're wildly different. And so we're paying at the midpoint. So if you shop around, you can actually not only get access to care, but you can access care and actually get cash back. That same occurrence happens in medical services. So doctor visits to knee replacements. You can always shop around and find care. And since in the US healthcare system, care cost and care quality are uncorrelated, right? So it creates not only an opportunity for you to get the best care also at the lowest price, it also creates an opportunity at scale for providers to ultimately get rewarded for delivering amazing quality, which they should, and they don't today because patients don't know when they engage with the healthcare system, they're in fact buying care. No one thinks about it that way, and we should.
That's great. And so since you raised the drug pricing discrepancy, Jenny, can you talk a little bit about what the point was behind trying to eliminate the gross to net bubble and maybe get into some of those dynamics with, around the rebate rule and how, maybe
I mean,
this kind of model would address some of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's startling about the example you gave is how different in some ways the drug piece is from the rest of the healthcare system, because the fundamental issue, I think, for patients is that, the fundamental issue is that patients are paying cost sharing not based on the cost of the drug to their insurer. So if they're paying it based on sort of the undiscounted list price. And I think the challenge is that as the difference between the list price and the net price grows, and as insurers get larger and larger discounts, which they use primarily to reduce premiums as opposed to give patients those savings at the pharmacy counter, there are more and more distortions in the system. I think that's, stepping back on the drug market, and like lessons what it, for the rest of the healthcare system. I do think that, we're now at a situation for brand drugs where 50 cents out of every dollar that is spent on brand drugs goes to a health plan, a PBM, a distributor, like the government, like somebody other than the brand manufacturer. So the spending, when you look at it sort of on gross level, is so, it's reported at like literally twice what it actually is, right? So, and there are a lot of people now who are benefiting from the prices of drugs that are not manufacturers. And so we're in this spiral where there's so much arbitrage and there's so much, so many costs, frictional costs for intermediaries, administrative costs, if you will, that it's very hard to reform the system. The disappointment in this bill is that it doesn't go at that. In fact, it takes two giant steps backwards by repealing a rule that would have changed it. Admittedly, would have been a very aggressive change, perhaps more than is easy to swallow in one bite. But we're not talking about alternative ways to make sure that patients can get those savings, because at the heart of it, we still face a situation where take a drug that costs $100 as a list price, where the insurer might be spending, $40. The patient is paying 20% coinsurance, not on the $40 price to the insurer, but on the, $100 sticker price, which is just patently unfair, right? So they're paying $20 for a $40 drug instead of $8. You add that up for patients with chronic conditions, and it's just nutty. I still think we have that big problem, and that patient problem reflects sort of broader conflict of interest problems in the system that are leading to higher costs for everyone and contribute to low take-up of biosimilars and a host of other challenges. I think the lesson is, if we don't, you can see in drug pricing what happens if multiple parts of the industry don't get together and solve that proactively ahead of time by getting, as you say, out of the way of the invisible hand. What happens is, if you don't get some of that under control, Congress has the answer. And it doesn't necessarily come in nuanced ways. It comes with blunt force. So, I think that's something that the hospital industry needs to be worried about. Insurers need to worry about it, because at the end of the day, our system is getting more and more expensive, and administrative costs are rising really fast. And we kind of need to get a handle on making sure that patients have an experience from the healthcare system that they feel is in line with the cost.
Excellent point. And since you opened the door to solutions and what Congress is doing, Ben, I want to flip over to you. you wrote a paper recently about competition in healthcare markets, and you had a series of solutions there. Where do we need to go? What do we do about this challenge?
Well, there's a lot of options. One of the last couple of comments did remind me, though. I think there's this unifying theme that we see a lot in healthcare that we don't see in a lot of other markets, save for maybe higher education. The pricing complexity really makes a lot of these competition issues more challenging. When you don't know what the price is, when different prices apply to different people, the incentives aren't aligned. If you have an insurer who faces a net price and they can offer a patient a list price based out-of-pocket payment, what does that allow them to do? Unwind community rating and lower the premiums, right? So you have divergent incentives coming from a very complex pricing environment. So one of the themes I'm hearing, and I think is important to this, is just making the pricing schemes more sane, to the point that A, people can understand what the heck is going on, and B, the incentives are aligned between the two groups, right? You, the consumer, and the agent, your insurer, whoever it might be, who's acting on your behalf, right? At least can we get those incentives aligned, and can we get those prices to some point where it's a little bit easier for a normal person to understand? When I look at the broader competition question, I think there has to be an acknowledgement. Look, as we've talked about, there are some things that you're just never going to be able to solve that are sort of unique. There are emergencies happen, and that's fine. But when we think about the market sort of more broadly, it seems to me that step one just has to be like an all-on assault on all of these incentives to consolidate right now. You got to rethink how we're doing things like 340B. We've got to tighten up site neutral payments more. We've got to think about the way the FTC and the DOJ are enforcing our antitrust rules. We've got to think about who needs to report what mergers. Are we at the point where we should not let people just keep doing small acquisitions without even telling anybody, right? These kinds of things are reasonable questions. And in markets where we already see quite a bit of consolidation, do we need to think about maybe taking baby steps towards saying there are some contracting practices that maybe we shouldn't be allowing if we've allowed markets to get sufficiently consolidated? Should we allow all or nothing contracting? Should we allow most favored nations contracting in some circumstances? I think at a minimum, those are questions that a reasonable person ought to be asking at this point, even if the answer is no. Beyond that, I think the second question is, are there opportunities to expand markets? And there's not that many. And so where there are, I think we really got to try and take advantage of them. Telehealth is a great example, right? What are you doing? You're expanding the network. You're expanding the effectively geographic market of providers from which you can seek services beyond your neighborhood. That's really, really powerful. The same thing goes for scope of practice, right? If suddenly you don't have to see somebody who has a comma MD, you can see someone who has a comma, MA or whatever. Well, that's really important. Suddenly, there's 3 times as many people in my neighborhood that can do this. We've just actually expanded a market, right? There's not that many opportunities to expand markets. And so where there are opportunities, that to me seems like an extremely important tool. And so if I were to rank order things, those would be where I would start. That's a long list already, but that's certainly where I would start.
Well, and I'd mentioned that just last week, or maybe the week before, Senator Baldwin, along with Senator Braun, introduced a bill to address those contracting provisions in the uncompetitive markets, to say you can't do those anti-tiering, anti-steering, MFN, all or nothing type contracts because they're anti-competitive. And that's kind of rules of the road.
Yeah, and I think this is a good lesson that you have this conversation with folks on the Hill all the time. I do too, where it's like we're trying to think about, when we think about the healthcare market, a high price is not necessarily bad. If a high price is attached to high value, that's great, right? I don't care. I would have paid a lot more for my COVID vaccine. But it's a problem when a high price is attached to something that we don't think is generating a lot of value. And so when we think about sort of which prices are bad, it's key to identify what's the source of that price. And so we're talking a lot about competition, right? That's a key example. And like you say, when you think about targeting policies, contracting, restricting contracting provisions doesn't necessarily do anything if you're in a competitive market. Because if you're in a really competitive market and you want to demand some restrictive contracting provision, so just say, and you're not worth it, they'll just say no, and they'll go to somebody else, right? But where does it bite? It only bites in the circumstances that we think the high price stems from a thing that we don't think is generating a lot of value, right? So in that sense, it's a reasonably good targeted policy. I like it. I know not everybody doesn't like it. I actually think it's reasonable in the sense that it's relatively well targeted towards the fundamental problem, which isn't the price per se. It's the thing that generates a price that's diverging from value.
So, Patrick, I want to pick up on two things Ben said. Make pricing sane and align incentives so the patient and their agent, the insurer, are in the same boat. Sounds like what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with Ben, right? Like, I mean, the whole concept of a network actually reduces competition, reduces choice, makes things opaque. And how can you actually end up in lowering the cost of care if nobody knows what the prices are, if no one has choices to reward specific providers for being excellent, to actually go someplace where they're getting the right value for what they believe we're paying. So that is exactly right. So that's why we kind of view our model as modern common sense health insurance. Like, we think that all of the additional kind of administrative costs that Jenny talked about in the pharma chain, like, those aren't adding value for the member. And if we just focused on paying for actually the care that's being delivered, then we can actually lower the cost of care for everyone while actually keeping the value of the care high, or actually growing the value of the care. So how do you align incentives? Well, you tell people what the prices are, and that's great. So transparency is super powerful, but it's not enough. You have to take that transparency, you have to combine it with incentives to engage in your healthcare. Like, one of the things that we really struggle with, and it's kind of just a thought to leave on, is that, like, we have been trained in the US healthcare system to ask one question of the healthcare system, and that is, are you in network? It's the wrong question. The question should simply be, what does this cost? Because as soon as you are focused on what the costs are, you can make decisions on the value that you're receiving. And as soon as you're having a conversation about what the costs are, you can go ahead and get a provider that's telehealth, that might be remote, where I can get better access, or I can go down the street to someone because they're delivering better value in person. And you can, once you have a question about cost and you're not constrained and you have aligned incentives with transparency, that's when we can see our cost in the US actually lower and become aligned with, I don't know, the rest of the world. We just have different administrative costs, and we don't have to. We have set up a system and a policy framework that, as everyone is pointing out, is facilitating higher prices.
So what's your biggest hurdle to getting where you need to be? If your model is adopted, it sounds disruptive. What if it were like everywhere, what would the impact be?
Oh, it's massive. The impact is massive. So, the analogy we always like to use is electric cars. Like, I think that everybody can sit around right now and know that, like, 10 years, 15 years from now, at some point in the future, we're all going to be driving electric cars, right? It is clear the advantages that electrification has over internal combustion engine. So we see the same advantages in transparent, choice-driven, incentively aligned healthcare. Like, if we can move to a model where consumers are actually knowing the price and have incentives to make good decisions, the overall cost of care shifts. And this isn't theoretical. Like, we've been operating for 2 years. We can see it in claims data. Our actual claims costs are 40% lower than traditional negotiated rates. That is a fact. It's because people actually can see the price. Providers reward people for getting paid instantly because they don't have to deal with the administrative costs. So how do you get to a world where everybody is doing this? It's kind of like, how do we develop better battery technology so that we can have electric cars everywhere? We need to have more transparency. We need to have more information. Members, of all health plans, everybody needs to know what their portion is before they engage the healthcare systems, right? So that people want to know what their costs are going to be. We've somehow all gotten comfortable with the fact that, like, we're going to hope it's going to work out, and I might get a bill, 3 months from now after a surgery. That's not okay. We need to move to a world where that's not going to happen. And the only way we do that is by actually aligning incentives and transparency. It's going to take time, and we need to have policies that facilitate innovation, right? That don't keep everything constrained. But it seems, to us, as we look at the data in our members, like, it seems inevitable because providers and members like it more.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, like, that I think is the fundamental issue, but we won't find, it goes deeper, I think, than consumer transparency, because we do live, to Benedict's point, in a world where hospitals can buy a drug for a penny and then sell it to a health plan at thousands of dollars, and charge patients, a share of that, So I think until we can get at some of the financial engineering in the system, and the sort of incentives there, the conflict of interest, we won't make as much progress as we need to, because the ROI is sort of infinite. if you can buy that low and then turn around and sell it to someone else at like a really high price.
But if the person themselves is purchasing that, they're not going to be willing to pay $100 for something that costs a penny. Market forces will prevent it. At least that's what we see.
Well, that's right. If you can, right now it's not available to them any other way, right?
So
I mean, that's-
I see Congressman Peters and Congressman Arrington coming on. Jason, I want to give you the last word. We've heard unconstrained to constrained, or sorry, constrained to unconstrained. You're facing kind of the opposite problem, kind of this, Wild West, where do we need to go here in the lab side? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. A lot of the issues we see in the laboratory side is truly similar to the pharmacy side and what Benedict's brought up, and Patrick as well, as the pricing arbitrage between different locations of receiving the service. If you're going to get a vitamin D test, the quality and the information you're getting from that test is going to be the same no matter where you get it, but the pricing difference can be 10 times difference between going to see an independent lab or going to see a hospital lab or a physician office. So there's a lot of pricing arbitrage, and we think price transparency will be a big part of that. I also agree the incentives need to align up, but clearly I think they're a little more simple than they are in the pharma industry. But I think competition is going to be a big part of that, and I think price transparency in the laboratory space is going to foster in a lot of that visibility and competition in that space, and right sizing of the price to value that Benedict brought up.
Excellent. Well, we are going to take the information from this panel and consolidate it into some recommendations for members of Congress and the administration to move forward. We'll make sure we run it past you guys, but I absolutely want to thank you guys. This has been an excellent panel, an engaging discussion. We're going to switch over now to hear from our members of Congress. I want to thank you guys for participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congressman Peters, how are you?
Great, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I think Congressman Arrington is on as well, but he may be joining us in a bit.
Okay.
Well, maybe not. We'll start out, Congressman Peters, with you. Thank you for joining us. Obviously a very busy time in Congress. There's Congressman Arrington.
Jody?
Obviously a very busy time in Congress right now. You are a Democrat from California. Congressman Arrington, you're a Republican from Texas. Two very different states.
Whoa, that was a close call, Joel.
A very close call. Very close call. Yes.
Very few people make that mistake, Joel.
No, it's he's going to not let me live that one down for a long time. I can tell you that. Both leaders, in the House, and but you came together, and obviously we're dealing with some fairly significant partisan divides over issues and culture and other things. But you all came together in the 30 for 30 caucus. Can you maybe explain a little bit about what 30 for 30 is for, and why you guys came together around these issues?
Jody, you want to start?
Sure, I would just say that there are people on both sides of the aisle that are very concerned about the deficit and debt trajectory that we're on and the implications to our country. We don't know when the dominoes fall, but we know when they do, it will be epic in its disastrous impact on our, not just our economy, but the societal impact at large. And so we have a lot of different ideas on both sides of the aisle, and but one thing we can agree on: the current construct, system, process in Congress is fundamentally broken. So no matter how many good people like Scott and other colleagues who I work with on this issue, no matter how many good people you throw at this, if the process is broken, you're going to get broken outcomes. And that's exactly what we've gotten from this institution and this area of great dysfunction. And when we started looking out during the pandemic at the monies we would have to spend, we acknowledged, both Republican and Democrats, that in order to stave off a protracted recession and to protect our citizens and frontline workers, et cetera, we were going to have to do some things, if not on a temporary and targeted measures, we were going to have to do some things to help us get back to our feet. But while we were going to spend that money on top of the trillions of dollars in debt and the 1 trillion annual deficit that we had pre-pandemic, we thought this is as good a time as any to include some process reforms that would force Congress, both parties, to get in a room, figure it out, make the decisions that are responsible for the electorate and governing our country. Scott?
Yeah, I would just say too, and I think the problem isn't getting any easier. One of the things that I think happened after we agreed we needed to invest money to keep the pandemic from becoming a depression was that people got even more casual about money, I think. And we need to pay close attention to this fiscal trajectory, because as Jody said, everyone tells us this is not sustainable, but what they don't really say, they don't really know when it's going to fall. But when it falls, it'll be too late. I mean, we're talking about real catastrophe. So Jody and I are committed to starting to implement better practices around budgeting and around how we think about our long-term programs, so that we don't face these cliffs.
So you would both say we should balance the budget.
And I would say, well, I don't know. I would say no. I think not immediately. I think what we need to do is, what we have to aim for is getting the growth of the economy to be faster than the growth of the debt. If you tried to balance the budget in 1 year, you could really choke the economy. And I don't think we need to do that. I actually would say, and I haven't talked to Jody about this, but some level of debt is probably appropriate. There are things you can borrow for that provide a return that's greater than the cost of borrowing. Families do that, businesses do that. That's okay, but we're way past that now. We're borrowing, as Jody said, $1 trillion a year to fund our expenses, and that is not sustainable.
Yeah, and I agree. I think there's a responsible level of debt relative to the size of our economy. And I think over the last 50 years, it's been about 40 to 50%. And today, it's 100% and rising, and soon to be past World War II, which was a kind of a one-time spend. We're on a trajectory of a continual growth in spending. And you've got to look at both sides. I want to throw this out here because I think it's important for your people to hear this. When Reagan worked on the last reform to address the insolvency of Social Security, it took Republicans and Democrats to agree that everything had to be on the table, both on the revenue side and the expenditure side, or the benefit side, in order to fulfill the promise to our seniors and to make for a sustainable program for the next generation. I don't know where the Reagans are. I know I found one in Scott Peters, and he's a guy that has shown that he is a man of principle. He's made some courageous decisions and stances, and we don't judge each other for the decisions we make. Ultimately, he's accountable to his constituents, and I am to mine, but I know that he's willing to do the thing that is necessary in all of this. And there are 9 ways to skin a cat in terms of solving problems, but there's only, one thing that's necessary in today, in my opinion, and that's political courage. Scott has that, and I think our team does. And at the right time, I think you're going to see some of these reforms go through. We just saw State of the Fiscal Nation as a reform to raise in the consciousness of Congress and the American people an annual fiscal State of the Nation. That's something that Scott and my colleagues worked on, and that was one of the 30 for 30 initiatives that we were driving.
So let's talk about this a little bit, because the details matter, and it's hard to do, right? It's hard to do what you suggest, Congressman Peters, to make that spending or that debt grow slower than the economy. So about 65% of the budget is entitlement spending or mandatory spending. About 43% of that is healthcare spending. So how do we make a meaningful dent in healthcare spending, right? Knowing that the hospital or the doc or the drug company or the device manufacturer in your district or who comes in to meet with you, has an ox gourd, right? Quite frankly, how do we start getting our arms around this? Because there's a lot of folks who benefit from the current system.
Well, there are a lot of vested interests. We're trying to handle drug pricing on our side of the aisle. I would say I took a little bit different viewpoint than most of my party, in that I wanted to make sure that we preserve incentives for future investment and innovation. I think we've reached that balance. I think the Grassley Wyden bipartisan bill would have done a lot of that. We've gone just a little bit further by allowing for negotiation at the end of some periods of exclusivity. Maybe that will help on the drug side. But on the insurance side, on the hospital side, there are other measures we have to take. I think that dealing with healthcare is probably a lot of different strategies, not one big silver bullet. And one thing I know you're all interested in is in competition. I'm interested in that. Price transparency is really important for that. That's been difficult to get in a lot of places. I would certainly support that. I think probably Jody, as a market conservative, would support that as well. He and I probably have different views about the ACA, but if you think about the Affordable Care Act, the idea was to create these exchanges with competition. The more robust we can make those, I think, in terms of covering what needs to be covered and making them transparent so that consumers can have choices and do real shopping, I think that would be useful as well. I think but the idea of providing competition, information, and empowerment to consumers is one thing where you find a lot of agreement.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so let's talk. You brought up the prescription drug issue. I think we've seen some criticisms from industry, from conservatives saying, well, this really just sets prices and we'd have fewer products and less competition as a result. How do you respond to some of those issues?
I don't think that's right, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that we give, look, the ecosystem is a partnership of the public sector and the private sector. So on the public side, we invested in the National Institutes of Health to do basic scientific research, 41 billion. The United States wrote the playbook for that. But we don't commercialize drugs. We don't really do that. Just like when the Department of Defense created the internet or GPS, it was the private sector that commercialized those things. And the magic of this is that private investors do this without any risk to federal taxpayers. So we don't have to pay as taxpayers for anything until it comes out the other end and FDA says it's safe and effective. So it's kind of a pretty good deal for us, I think. But the one thing you don't want to do is scare people off from making those investments. And what we had, the original Democratic proposal, which I objected to, would have allowed really price setting from day one. And that would have said to every investor, don't bother, you're never going to make a return. What we wanted to do is provide a reasonable period of exclusivity, and patents expire. We all understand that patents don't last forever. And so I think the goal that we had was to try to set a reasonable amount of time for people to market and recover their investment, to keep that incentive there without letting that go on forever. So let's encourage those same people to make new inventions. I hope we got it right. It will be a change, but I think most people would say it's a more modest change than the Democrats had originally proposed en masse. And I think it's a better product. I hope it strikes the right balance. I think it probably does.
So just to stick with you for 1 second. So just to, so our audience understands. So you're basically taking the VA pricing, it's called the non-federal AMP, right, price. Was there any magic to that, or was that just kind of like something that we had done, and so it was a model that we could replicate, or are there other prices that we might look at that could be maybe a little bit more appropriate? Because concern from, again, industry and some conservatives is, well, that we see the impact on the veterans model, where we have only 52% of the top 200 drugs available. Was there any magic there, or
There's lots of ways to negotiate prices. I think the magic for us was to provide a period of exclusivity.
Got it.
Not to have that negotiation start right away, but really to really give a runway for investors to get their money back. Because look, frankly, if someone invents a cure for Alzheimer's, I want that person to be very wealthy, right? I'm okay with that, right?
Yeah.
Because if we spend $250 billion a year on Alzheimer's, there's a lot of room for savings. So
Yeah.
if that person makes $1 billion or $2 billion a year, that's a big win for everybody. We have to think of it that way. But the risk is that there's so much antipathy for the industry that people wanted to cut that off right away. But that would kill really the ability to create cures. We have a cure for hepatitis C because someone wanted to put the money in a cure. Now that means no liver transplants, and it came out at $84,000, sure, but competition came in, drove the price down. That's how it's supposed to work. So we want innovation, we want competition. Where there's no competition after a long period of time, then it might be appropriate for government to negotiate. And we should come up with a system of negotiation that's not draconian and not price setting, but mainly we should delay that so that people have a chance to recover their investment.
Congressman Arrington, you have thoughts on that?
Well, my first thought is, thank God Scott Peters is inside the Democrat Party working to strike a balance between innovation, competition, and government's role in healthcare and managing care. And I would say that my philosophical view is to harness the forces of competition and market forces as best we can. There are failures that have to be addressed in rural areas where you have a monopoly and single provider in terms of hospitals. You have to deal with that. There are ways to do it. And you also have people that pre-existing conditions and an expensive proposition to care for themselves or their loved ones. If you did a risk-based pricing of that, you'd price them out of the market. So I'm not one that thinks that government has no role. I just think that markets are the most well-equipped to get at the best price point and quality, that sort of value proposition. And government and CMS bureaucrats that are trying to work through all these codes will never optimize that. And look, I'm very sensitive and equally concerned with some of the runaway pricing on the innovative drug products. And I'm sympathetic, and President Trump was for the IPI because he was saying, look, if we're going to subsidize these via taxpayers and then give a less price point for foreign markets and citizens of another country, hey, I don't care what town hall you're in, that doesn't play. And so what at least President Trump's mindset, I can't speak for Scott and his colleagues, but was, hey, if they're doing deals and giving these prices, that is somewhat of a market. But I think the better way to go about it, rather than index or fix a price, is to introduce competition earlier and enforce IP provisions in our trade agreements so that we eliminate these free riders, which will put a downward pressure on pricing in the United States. I think central to the distortion of market forces, which we're trying to harness, Scott put it in a way of on the front end of innovation with respect to investment. You don't want to take away that incentive to make the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, 9 out of 10 of which will fail before they get through all the drug trials and before they get to the bedside. But I would look at the exclusivity instead of doing IPI, price fixing, government negotiation. I'll put quotes around that for me. I would say, let's let the market negotiate that, but let's not get a one size fits all. Republicans are really fond of saying one size fits all government programs or mandates or regulations. I don't believe we should have a one size fits all exclusivity path, which is a monopoly for all products with all size markets and all profit margins. There should be nuance to that. And then we should make sure that they're not gained as well. If you can tighten up the bolts around that, I think you'll see prices drop, among other things like PBM. There's distortion there with PBMs for sure, in my opinion. And then there's some great things that Scott and my Democrat colleagues and Republicans can do together on the donut hole, the coverage continuum, making sure that taxpayers aren't on the hook for catastrophic care as insurance companies are incentivized to pull patients up to the most expensive part of that coverage continuum.
So that's a really interesting idea, Congressman. So basically, if you have like a product that might have a higher societal value, like an innovator breakthrough type product, maybe you have a longer exclusivity period. And if you're doing another Lipitor or another like, cholesterol buster or something like that, maybe you have a lesser exclusivity period, something like that.
I think that's right. I mean, some would call, it's not reference pricing. It's just tailored exclusivity, because once we give exclusivity, you have a monopoly, and you got to be real careful because to me, that is the heart of the market distortion. It's a constitutional provision and protection. It is the base foundation of incentivizing the R&D, to Scott's point, but it can also be the very thing that's abused to gouge and to take more than what is due in that public good private interest exchange.
Joel, there's a concept called value-based pricing that we talk about a lot, but we haven't figured out yet. But the idea is that you would pay for therapies based on the value that they provided. So if you were, I think it is $250 billion a year on Alzheimer's, we could pay a lot for that and still save taxpayers money. Whereas if it was something like another statin, maybe again, that wouldn't be as valuable an innovation. I'd like to probably work with folks like Jody to think about that, because that's another way to help the federal budget keep costs out from running rampant.
Congressman, music to my ears. We've spent about 5 years working on that very concept with some of our members. We have legislative language and everything. We'll send your way. It's a great idea. Yeah, it's you pay for an outcome, not a pill.
Right. Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked about 10% of the healthcare dollar, which is the prescription drug share. There's 90% left. The vast majority of that in hospital spend. Obviously, people are sicker, more intensive care. About a third of that in physician spend. So one of the things that I like to think about is, I could drive from my office here in Washington, D.C. to Seattle, down to San Diego, over to Miami, through Texas, obviously, and never drive through a competitive. Right. I would stop off on the way for some barbecue, but I'd never drive through a competitive hospital market. And the best measure is that about 90% of all our hospital markets are highly uncompetitive. What we know in those hospital markets is that prices are higher, access and choice is less. And that makes up a third of that healthcare spend dollar. Any ideas around hospital world where we could see and encourage more competition?
Well, I'll just, since I represent a big swath of rural Texas that we refer to as God's country, I've been trying to get Scott to come out for a football game. And
I was supposed to come this weekend. I had this thing I couldn't avoid, but now I don't even know if I'll be in Washington for the weekend.
Well, I hope you're not. I hope you're still in Washington working on that reconciliation bill and not there. That gives me something.
Thanks, Jody.
Eternal. No, look, I think, rural hospital, we worked on this with Terry Sewell and Henry Cuellar. This has been a bipartisan effort. And I co-chair with Terry the Rural Healthcare Task Force. And we're looking at ways to make it a sustainable proposition to even operate a hospital in rural America, where you don't have the patient volume, number one, and the payer mix is horrible. So Scott and I, if we were in the private sector, probably wouldn't analyze that market and think there was an opportunity. So there's a public good to have a network of basic care for all Americans. What I think we need to do, and we introduced and passed in the last Congress, a payment model that helped reduce costs, gave freedom and flexibility to rural hospitals, to not have inpatient if they didn't need it and couldn't afford it, be an emergency center, outpatient clinic, et cetera, have some sort of hub and spoke with the larger hospitals. I think value-based care, value-based, risk-based payment models are the way to go. And then you introduce full-on telehealth and telemedicine. We did some of that, made it permanent. We did a lot of it during COVID. Some of that went away. Some was made permanent. We need to go all in, but we have to regulate for overutilization. Listen to what I'm saying about regulate. Letting the market do that by saying you have to hit these quality outcomes, efficiency outcomes, cost outcomes, and we will take peer groups, comparable markets in rural areas, and that's how we're going to carrot and stick a good, affordable, efficient healthcare system in places like you said that don't have the competition and the forces, market forces, to bring the cost down and keep the quality up at the same time.
Congressman Peters?
I can't speak to rural hospitals. I actually have obviously a pretty urban district, but with respect to hospitals, it was a little bit of a black box. I would say I had one experience where there's a program called 340B, which is intended to provide lower cost pharmaceuticals to hospitals that carry particularly difficult patient loads. And Dr. Bouchon and I just asked for an accounting. Oh my gosh, you just thought that we'd actually tried to blow up the hospital or something like that. The reaction was unbelievable. And I think that a lot of this, a lot of what we probably have to tackle is transparency. I do think that the most powerful driver is price. And I know that President Trump, to his credit, talked about making sure that prices were more transparent, but that still is very, very difficult to get at. What's the procedure? This procedure costs here. And I have a number of different hospitals, including military hospital, or veterans hospitals and military hospitals in my area. But you can't figure out what a knee replacement costs from place to place. And no market can work without that information and that access. So I guess fundamentally, I think that's probably a good place to start. But this experience I had trying to figure out why this particular program had grown so much over such a short period of time, the amount of resistance from the hospital community was really surprising to me. I had ads run against me by someone who's benefiting from the program. And fortunately, no one in San Diego knows what 340B is, so it didn't get people too excited. But gosh, he spent a lot of money calling me names. But I'm used to that, Jody.
Say 340B is not the best bumper sticker for a campaign, but
Right. Yeah.
I would say to Scott's anecdote, it is very tough to get our arms around these debt drivers, mainly healthcare, which represents a third of the cost. And then you add Social Security, you've got 50% of the entire federal budget. And by the way, Medicare costs will grow 2 times over the next 10 years, or $80 trillion. Meanwhile, our debt is projected to grow. This is as is today, okay, as our balance sheet is today, by $100+ trillion. Now, that just to say that's not sustainable is to state more than the obvious. It's to be totally disconnected to what we've got to do in the near term. But what Scott's saying with 340B, for example, just saying, did that benefit pass to the patient utilizing the hospital? And then he had attack ads, and just imagine what would be the case if it was Social Security benefits or something in Medicare. So it's not for the faint of heart if we're going to save the country from what I think is going to be the crisis that you can't bail out of, and which certainly off of it.
These programs are on the cusp of insolvency, and so it's funny because I can't remember if it's 2031 or 2034 for Social Security, maybe. But when it goes sideways, it's an automatic across the board cut of 20%, right? So if you are for the status quo, you're for a 20% cut in Social Security.
Mhm.
I think we should start thinking about it that way. That's a good reason to sit down and do something like Jody and I have endorsed concepts like the Trust Act that would, force people to come together and create a solution. Maybe not in a congressional setting where it's so difficult, but maybe do some action forcing process that would get us to these resolutions. It's going to be the same problem with Medicare as well. So it doesn't help anybody for us to ignore it, and it is difficult to do these things. I'm saying that it's not for the faint of heart, but gosh, I don't know sometimes why people want these jobs if they don't want to do these jobs. For me, I have to leave San Diego every week, which is a heck of a lot nicer place to be.
And I have to leave 3 young children in God's country. I'm with Scott, and I think this is the mentality that you have to have. And I'm not saying I've fully exercised my political courage, maxed out yet, but I would
Your
tell
time's
you,
coming.
but my
Time's
time
coming.
is coming. And listen, if you can't come to terms with and be at peace with the fact that you may be run out of this town back to your state and your home, because you've done something that took tremendous risk, but you did it to save the country from calamity. Listen, that's the way I want to go. I want my great grandchildren saying they ran his country butt out of Washington because he was willing to be courageous. And that is bottom line what it's going to take. We've got some great solutions. Do we have the political will, a critical mass of political will to actually move something forward before the crisis? Because then it'll be imposed on all of us in a way that we don't want to even contemplate right now.
A great way to end. Appreciate that last comment there. Gentlemen, I really appreciate your joining us today. I really appreciate what you're trying to do for the country. Because as you said, the implications of doing nothing are far worse. So really appreciate
Joel, I
your time
appreciate the
today.
chance, and to the extent you have ideas, I hope you'll share them with us. Jody and I are 2 people looking for ways to get into good trouble. So let us know.
You've already managed to do that this year, Mr.
Yeah.
Congressman.
I have to give my staff a little rest, but after a couple months, we'll take on another fight.
Well, I know Congressman Arrington shares that view too. He gets into trouble quite a bit too.
I do. And I appreciate you, Joel, we need to do more of this. One of the things I will say from a very Republican district, I think my PVI is now at 100, Scott, after redistricting. It's the highest PVI in Texas, but I take great pride in having bipartisan initiatives and reforms and relationships, and it's good for my soul. And I just know most of the big things, you can do things in a partisan way. It's not the most sustainable. And generally the biggest things will require you to have a friend and a partner you can call on. And I'm just so grateful. I really am, for Scott and other Democrat colleagues of mine. Even when we're vehemently at the most opposite ends on policy making, I have tremendous respect for him, and I look forward to the opportunities when we find that common space. So thanks you.
Jody. Likewise.
Yeah, well, this is a model. I wish we had more bipartisanship. You guys are doing a great job of leadership, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Be well.
God bless. Thank y'all.
All right. Thank you again. All right. So interesting conversation with the bipartisan duo there, and really fascinating conversation too on the panel. As I indicated during the panel, we are synthesizing all these ideas into a series of recommendations that we'll make available to all the attendees here, and we'll be discussing with Congress and the administration in the months and maybe years to come. All of the issues that we've talked about, the cost issues, the coverage and access issues, and the competition issues are critically important as we shift some of our attention away from coverage, universal coverage, and into how do we make this sustainable and affordable for the long term. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is the final institution of our annual policy summit. I also, again, want to thank our sponsors, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, Better Medicare Alliance, and Pharma. And we look forward to working with everyone on this call as we, again, seek the solutions that will help make health coverage more affordable. Thanks so much.